"I'll not marry a woman of 30, the Duke of Hallamer had said, at a dinner he no longer enjoyed being reminded of, in a voice so flat that 3 footmen mistook it for a joke and laughed before they understood their error. He had been 23 at the time, freshly buried a father, freshly inherited a house with more locked doors than open ones, and entirely convinced that a rule, properly drafted, could do the work that grief refused to do. 9 years later the rule still stood, filed under clause the 4th of a document his staff called, without affection, the Standard, and nobody at Hallamer had seen him smile without meaning to in all that time, though Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, had kept a ledger of the near misses, and the ledger currently stood at 11. This is the story of how both numbers changed, though not on any schedule the Duke had approved. It concerns a woman named Cassia Merrow, 30 years old and 3 months, a vicar's daughter with no fortune, no family beyond a spinster aunt in Millbrook, and an unfortunate habit of laughing at things before she had determined whether laughing was permitted. It concerns a goose named Plato, who had strong opinions and no patience for waiting to share them. It concerns a walled garden that had been locked for 9 years, and a rose that had gone on blooming inside it whether anyone gave it leave or not. By spring, the Duke could not recall what his house had been like without her in it. But first, the advertisement, and the journey, and the particular indignity of falling into a duke's ornamental pond on one's first afternoon of employment. The advertisement had run in the Millbrook Gazette for a fortnight before Cassia answered it, mostly because she had read it 7 times and could not decide whether it was serious. Wanted, it said, a companion of good sense and steady temperament for the Dowager Duchess of Hallamer. Applicants of excessive youth or excessive frivolity need not apply. It was, as advertisements went, the only one in the history of the paper to specifically discourage youth, and Cassia, who possessed neither youth nor, by her own frequent admission, an excess of anything but opinions, had written back the same evening. She had nothing to lose by it. She had been overlooked for a decade by every drawing-room in the county, on the grounds of being unmarried too long, and unmarried in a manner people had stopped finding tragic and started finding merely factual, and she had discovered, somewhere around her 26th year, that the fastest way to survive being overlooked was to enjoy the view from wherever she happened to be standing. When the world sits you down in the mud, she had told her aunt once, drying her stockings by the fire after a wheel had thrown her from a cart into precisely that, you may as well laugh before it teaches you not to. Her aunt had said this was not a philosophy so much as a habit dressed in philosophy's clothes, and Cassia had agreed, cheerfully, and gone on doing it anyway. The Duke, for his part, required no advertisement, being already in supply of a title, an income that made 3 counties nervous, and a face that had been called handsome by women who had never once seen it do anything with the news. Gideon Vane had governed Hallamer for 9 years, the way a man governs a ship he does not trust the sea around, competently, without joy, and with an exhausting attention to procedure. He rose at the same hour every day. He read the estate accounts before breakfast and the correspondence after it. He had drafted the Standard in the raw weeks after his father's funeral, when his father's second marriage, hasty, ill-matched and cold on both sides almost from the wedding breakfast onward, had struck him as a cautionary tale requiring a cure, and the cure he had settled on was arithmetic. Marry young, marry early. Do not, under any circumstance that he could then imagine, marry a woman old enough to have already made her peace with being alone. Because such women, he had reasoned at 23, with the confidence of a man who has never been contradicted, did not fall in love. They merely settled. He had never revised the theory, chiefly because nothing had asked him to. The walled garden had been his mother's. In the years before the fever took her, when Gideon was 12, and the Duchess Seraphina Vane still walked its paths every morning with dirt under her nails, and a laugh that had reportedly carried as far as the stables. He had locked the door himself, at 23. On the same week he drafted the Standard, and had not been inside it since. The gardeners were forbidden it. The staff did not discuss it. It had become, over 9 years, less a room in a house than a held breath, and the household had organised its whole understanding of the Duke's grief around not disturbing it, which was, naturally, precisely where Cassia Merrow went first, on her second afternoon at Hallamare, in pursuit of a goose. Plato had strong feelings about the new companion, and had communicated them by stealing her second-best glove directly from her hand and conducting it, at speed, through a gap in the garden wall that the household had somehow never mentioned. Cassia, who did not yet know the wall concealed anything more significant than weeds, went after her glove the way she went after most things, without asking permission first, and with every intention of apologising afterward if it proved necessary. It proved necessary. The gap let out onto a path gone entirely to moss, roses grown wild and enormous over a dry stone fountain, and a goose standing in the exact centre of that fountain's shallow basin, glove in beak, looking extremely pleased with himself. "That is not yours," Cassia informed him, stepping in after it. The basin was deeper than it looked, and slicker, and the fountain had clearly not been dry so much as damp, in a manner the eye could not detect until the foot had already committed. She went down with a splash that startled a flock of sparrows out of the ivy, sat for a moment in 8 inches of green water, with a very indignant goose paddling triumphantly past her, and laughed. It was not a ladylike laugh. It came up out of her without asking, the kind of laugh that surprised the person doing it as much as anyone watching, and she was still laughing. Wringing out her second-best sleeve and informing Plato that he had won this round, but there would be others. When she became aware that someone was watching her from the garden's far gate, with an expression of a man doing complicated arithmetic and disliking the sum. He was tall, dressed with the particular severity of a man who dresses himself as an argument, and he looked at her the way one looks at an error in a ledger that has none the less been correctly added. "This garden is locked," he said. It was, she agreed, from the fountain, though I confess the goose seemed to feel otherwise. "You are trespassing." "I am also," she said, "extremely wet," which I had rather hoped might earn some sympathy ahead of the trespassing. But I take your point. She got to her feet with as much dignity as 8 inches of pond water allow a person, which was not a great deal, retrieved her glove from where Plato had abandoned it in disgust at her lack of struggle, and looked at him directly, which people at Hallamare generally did not do, because looking at the Duke directly tended to be met with a look that suggested the offence had been noted and would be addressed in writing. Cassia looked at him the way she looked at most things, unafraid and faintly amused, and something in the Duke's face did a small, complicated thing that he corrected before anyone could call it a reaction. "Who are you?" he said, "and why does my aunt's household contain a woman who falls into fountains?" "Cassia Merrow, your aunt's new companion, as of yesterday, and I would remind you that I did not fall in so much as follow a goose in, which I maintain is a meaningful distinction." "It is not," he said. "It is to the goose," she said, and left him standing at the gate of a garden he had not entered in 9 years, working out, with some private alarm, that he had very nearly smiled, and that this was the first time in longer than he cared to count that anyone had made the correction necessary. He told the stable boy who witnessed the whole affair from the wall that the matter had been dealt with. It had not, in fact, been dealt with at all. It had merely begun. Within a week, the Duke of Hallowmere had developed an urgent series of concerns regarding his aunt's household that required his personal attention at hours convenient chiefly to whoever happened to be visiting his aunt's sitting room. The garden gate, he said, wanted a new latch. The account book for the home farm had, he was nearly certain, an error in the third column, and it would be irresponsible to leave it unexamined. His aunt's companion, being new, would benefit from an interview regarding the household's expectations, an interview that somehow required his own presence rather than the housekeeper's, though housekeeping was, by his own standard, precisely the sort of matter he did not personally attend to. Nobody in the house believed a word of it, and everybody in the house was too well trained to say so aloud, which meant the whole matter was instead conducted through eyebrows. Mrs. Pruitt, who had run the household for 11 years and kept opinions the way other women kept china, informed Whitlock the butler over the breakfast dishes that his Grace had visited the home farm's ledger 4 times in 5 days, a household record, and that the ledger, so far as she could determine, had no error in it whatsoever, and never had. Whitlock's face did not change, being professionally incapable of changing, except for the left eyelid, which had developed over the years a small vocabulary entirely its own, and which now performed what the staff had come to call, privately, the very slow blink. It meant, roughly, I have seen this before, and I will not be the one to say so. He asked to see the beehive accounts today, Mrs. Pruitt said. We do not keep bees. No, Whitlock agreed. He was in there 40 minutes. Yes, Whitlock said, and blinked, very slowly, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it told the entire kitchen everything it needed to know. Cassia, for her part, gave the Duke very little to work with, which frustrated him more than outright encouragement would have. She answered his invented questions with real answers, because she did not know yet that they were invented, and her real answers had an unfortunate habit of being correct. Asked, under cover of discussing the home farm, whether she understood double-entry bookkeeping, she produced from memory the exact discrepancy in his steward's last quarterly report, a transposed figure that had cost the estate £11 nobody had noticed missing, and delivered the correction so plainly, without any flourish of triumph, that he found himself standing in his aunt's sitting-room holding a teacup he had forgotten to drink from. "You looked at my ledgers," he said. "You brought them," she said. I assumed that was an invitation. It was not an invitation. It was a test of your character. Then I have passed, and found you £11 besides, which I think entitles me to a second biscuit. She took one. He watched her take it with the particular attention of a man cataloguing evidence against a verdict he had already reached, and did not wish to revisit, and when his aunt, arriving late to her own sitting-room, asked what had made him linger so long over farm accounts he had never once cared for in 9 years, he said only that the matter had required thoroughness, and left before anyone could ask whose thoroughness, exactly, had required 40 minutes and 2 biscuits. He told himself, walking back across the lawn, that the visit had been about the ledger. The ledger had been correct within the hour of his arrival. He did not examine this discrepancy at any great length, which was itself a kind of answer, though not one he was prepared yet to file. The walled garden remained locked to everyone but the goose, who came and went through his private gap in the wall with the air of a landowner inspecting his holdings, and it was Cassia who first noticed, 3 weeks into her employment, that the lock on the outer gate had been recently oiled, though no one had opened it in years, and that someone had left a pair of shears just inside the gap in the wall where no shears had any business being. She said nothing of it to anyone. She had already begun, without deciding to, keeping her own quiet ledger of the small things the Duke did, and did not think anyone was watching, and she found, turning the shears over in her hand, that the entries were beginning to add up to something she was not yet ready to name aloud, not even to a goose who kept his own counsel, and, she suspected, understood a great deal more than he let on. The wound, when it finally surfaced the way most true things surfaced at Hallamere, which was sideways, over tea, from someone who had not intended to say it. Aunt Cordelia had lived at Hallamere for 30 years, first as the old Duke's aunt by marriage and now, by the accident of longevity, as the last person alive who remembered the house before it had learned to hold its breath. She was sharp, in the manner of a woman who has decided sharpness is more efficient than tact, and she liked Cassia within 4 days, though she did not say so, because saying so would have required admitting she had expected not to. It was Cordelia who told her, on an afternoon when the rain kept them both indoors with their needlework abandoned in their laps, that the walled garden had belonged to Seraphina, the old Duchess, and that Gideon had locked it himself the week his father died, and that nobody, not the gardeners, not the housekeeper, not Cordelia herself, had been permitted through that gate in 9 years. He does not speak of her, Cordelia said. He filed her instead. Grief, when a young man does not know what else to do with it, becomes a system. His father remarried too fast, too young a bride, and it was a cold house for it, and Gideon decided at 23 that arithmetic was a kinder god than chance. He has been obeying that god ever since. She looked at Cassia over her spectacles with an expression that was not quite a warning. "You are 30. "I am aware," Cassia said. "His arithmetic does not permit 30. "Then his arithmetic," Cassia said, mildly, "had better hope it is never asked to." Cordelia laughed at that, a short surprised bark of a laugh, and said nothing further. But she watched Cassia rather more closely after that afternoon, the way a woman watches a hand of cards she suspects may yet be worth playing. Cassia's own grief, when it came up lightly, the way she carried everything. Her father had died when she was 22, of a slow illness that had given them both time to say what needed saying, and she had grieved him properly, and then, deliberately, gone on being glad to be alive, because she had decided somewhere in that sick room that grief which refused all joy afterward was not loyalty, only exhaustion wearing loyalty's coat. She told this to no one directly. She simply lived it, visibly, which turned out to be a more persuasive argument than any speech could have been. By the 2nd week of November, without either of them declaring it, Gideon had begun walking the lower lane on Thursday afternoons, at precisely the hour Cassia walked Aunt Cordelia's small dog as far as the mill pond and back. Neither called it an arrangement. It became one anyway, the way water becomes a channel simply by running the same course often enough. He brought, on the 3rd Thursday, a jar of preserves from the home farm's kitchen, on the grounds that his aunt's companion ought to know the estate's produce, a reasoning so thin that even Whitlock, informed of it second hand, permitted himself the very slow blink twice in one sentence. "You are very sure of yourself, for a man who does not know how to give a woman a jar of jam without an excuse." Cassia said, accepting it. "It is not an excuse, it is an introduction to the home farm's produce." "Of course," she said. "And the walk to the mill pond is an inspection of the water table." "It is. in part. In part, she agreed, and something in the way she said it, not mocking, only naming the thing plainly, and letting him hear it named, made the corner of his mouth move in a direction it had not moved in company for some time. He caught it before it went anywhere Mrs. Pruitt's ledger might record, but not quite fast enough, because Cordelia's small dog, trotting ahead, chose that moment to look back at the pair of them with the frank curiosity of an animal who has also been keeping count. It was the rain, in the end, that did what 3 weeks of manufactured pretexts had not quite managed. A November storm came in off the hills faster than either of them had judged, and the walled garden's old glasshouse, its door left unlocked since the shears had first appeared, was the nearest shelter to hand. They went in wet and laughing, or she was laughing and he was doing the thing that in another man would have been called the beginning of it, and the glasshouse, full of his mother's dead season's growth gone silver with dust, held them both through an hour of rain that showed no sign of hurrying. She grew roses, Cassia said, running a finger along a shelf of cracked clay pots, each one labelled in a fine, slanting, long unread hand. This one says only Seraphina's Folly, no year. It was her name for the one she bred herself. It never took anywhere else. My father wrote to 3 nurseries trying to have it copied, after, and none of them could manage it. He said this looking somewhere past her shoulder, at nothing, in the manner of a man reading a room he has memorized rather than one he is presently in. I have not been in this glasshouse since I was 12. And now you are here because of the weather, she said, gently, not unkindly, which I do not entirely believe, any more than I believed the jam. He was quiet long enough that she thought she had gone too far. Then he said, in the broken, unpractised voice of a man handling a tool he has not picked up in years, she used to let me choose which cuttings to graft when I was small. I do not remember choosing badly, but I remember her insisting there was no such thing as a bad choice in a garden, only a slow one. I have not thought of that in longer than I can account for. He stopped, started again. I locked the gate because I could not walk past it without expecting to find her in it, and finding instead that she was not. Every single day seemed a poorer use of a morning than simply not walking past it at all. That is not nothing, Cassia said. That is grief with excellent bookkeeping. He looked at her then, directly, the way she had first looked at him across a fountain full of an indignant goose, and for 4 full seconds, Mrs. Pruitt would later date it precisely, from an account relayed by the under-gardener who happened to be oiling the glass-house hinges nearby, and heard rather more than he later admitted to hearing. The Duke of Hallamere smiled. Not the correction of one, not the suppression, but the whole undefended thing, before he remembered himself and folded it away. It was the first one anyone had confirmed in 9 years. The under-gardener told Whitlock before supper. Whitlock told Mrs. Pruitt. Mrs. Pruitt, without a word to anyone, took down her ledger and, for the first time since she had begun it, made an entry in the column she had long ago stopped expecting to use. Trouble in a house of this kind generally arrived by post, and Hallamere's arrived on a Tuesday in the shape of a letter from Lord Pemberton, an old friend of the late Duke, written in the confident hand of a man who has never once been told no, and does not anticipate beginning now. He wrote to remind Gideon, warmly, that his daughter Henrietta was 18 this spring, accomplished, and, he underlined this himself, as though it were the letter's chief argument, well within the bounds of what he understood, from conversations with the old Duke years before his death, to be the family's stated preference in the matter of brides. He proposed a visit before the month was out. He hoped, he wrote, that Gideon had not allowed 9 years of solitude to make him forget what he had once been so certain he wanted. Gideon read the letter twice at his desk, alone, and did not, for once, feel the small, clean satisfaction that a correctly applied rule generally gave him. He felt instead something closer to the sensation of a man discovering that a fence he built to keep something out has, with great efficiency, kept something in as well. He did not mention the letter to Cassia. He mentioned it, tersely, to Cordelia, who received the news with the particular calm of a woman who has been expecting a stupid thing to happen, and is grimly pleased to have been right about the timing. "You will have to answer him," she said. "I have not decided how." "You have decided," Cordelia said. "You are only unhappy about it, and left him to sit with that." Which he did, for the better part of an evening, staring at a letter that represented 9 years of his own arithmetic arriving, at last, to collect what it was owed. What he did, instead of answering it directly, was quietly renew, without informing anyone, the lease on the small cottage attached to the Millbrook living, the one Cassia's late father had held as vicar, and which had stood empty and half forgotten since his death, its roof going soft, its garden gone to bramble. Gideon sent his own steward to see it repaired, and its rent settled from the estate's account rather than the parish's, under no name that could be traced back to him. On the stated grounds, recorded nowhere but in his own head, that a companion of good sense and steady temperament ought to have somewhere of her own to return to, should she ever wish it, that was not owed to anyone's charity. He told no one. Whitlock found out only because the steward, not understanding the need for secrecy, mentioned it to the wrong footman, who mentioned it to Mrs. Pruitt, who added a second private entry to her ledger and said nothing to Cassia at all, on the grounds that some things a household is permitted to know before the person they concern. Aunt Cordelia's examination of Cassia, when it came, arrived without warning on a Thursday afternoon that had been meant for the mill pond, and instead became something considerably more like a tribunal. Cordelia had tea sent up, dismissed the footman, and looked at Cassia over her spectacles with the particular stillness of a woman about to do something she considers a kindness disguised as an unpleasantness. "Sit," she said. "I intend to ask you a number of things, and I would rather you answered them honestly than well." "That is generally the only way I know how to answer anything," Cassia said, sitting. "Do you love him?" Cassia did not deflect this one, though she deflected nearly everything else in her life as a matter of policy. "Yes," she said. Which is inconvenient, given his arithmetic, but there it is. "Are you after his title?" "I had a title offered to me once, by a baronet with gout and very little conversation, and I declined it. If I wanted a title, I would have taken the easier one. Are you after his money?" "I am after," Cassia said, "a man who visits a farm ledger 4 times in a week for no reason he will admit to, and I would want him precisely as much if the ledger belonged to a tenant farmer instead of a duke, which I recognise is not a fact you can verify, and which I offer you anyway, because it is the truest thing I have." Cordelia was quiet a long moment, turning her teacup a quarter turn in its saucer, and when she spoke again her voice had lost its edge entirely. "He does not know how to be loved without a reason attached to it. His father was loved for the title, twice over, and it went badly both times, and Gideon watched it happen at an age when a boy still believes his parents' example is the whole of the available evidence for how the world works. If you take him, you will have to keep taking him, every day, without a ledger to check it against." "Can you do that?" "I have been doing it since October," Cassia said, without asking anyone's permission, including his. Cordelia's eyes were, by this point, unmistakably wet, though she would have denied it to a magistrate. "Then you have already passed the only test that matters," she said, "and I am only sorry it took me this long to stop pretending I needed to give it." She reached over and took Cassia's hand. Briefly, in the manner of a woman who does not often permit herself gestures and rations them carefully when she does. Marry him quickly, when he finally works up the courage, and do not let him consult his standard first. The standard has done quite enough governing in this house. Gideon, meanwhile, had written and torn up 4 replies to Lord Pemberton, each one more honest than the last, and each one, for that reason, harder to send. Whitlock reported to Mrs. Pruitt that His Grace had been observed sighing, on one occasion audibly, over the account books, a thing that had not happened even during the difficult harvest 3 years prior. And Mrs. Pruitt, checking her ledger, noted that the near smiles had lately been outpacing the sighs by a comfortable margin, which she chose to take as an encouraging sign of the war's general direction. The Pemberton matter resolved itself with the particular anticlimax that mild obstacles in well-run households generally do. Gideon wrote back at last a letter of exactly 4 sentences, thanking Lord Pemberton for his continued friendship, wishing Miss Henrietta every happiness in whatever match her own inclinations favoured, and stating, without further ornament, that his own inclinations had already been settled by a woman his standard had never once anticipated, and would shortly be amended to reflect. Pemberton, who was transactional rather than cruel, and who had 3 other daughters, and no real investment in the outcome beyond convenience, took the refusal with good grace, wrote back a single congratulatory line, and was not heard from again in any way that troubled the story further. Nobody at Hallamere noticed him leave the narrative at all, which would have wounded him considerably had he known, being a man who liked to imagine himself more central to events than events generally required. The rain that had trapped them in the glasshouse in November had, by December, given way to a bitter, clear cold that Cassia found she loved for reasons she could not entirely explain to Cordelia, who thought all cold was simply summer's failure to attend properly to its duties. It was during this cold, 10 days before Cassia's birthday, that the frost nearly took Seraphina's rose. It had survived 9 years of neglect through some combination of luck and its own stubbornness, but the hard frost that settled over the walled garden that week found the old wood brittle and the graft unions weak, and Cassia, walking the garden at dawn out of habit now, rather than trespass, found the whole climbing structure of it bowed and blackening at the tips. She spent 2 days grafting new wood onto the strongest of the old canes, working with a steadiness Gideon found, when he came upon her at it on the 2nd afternoon, more moving than any speech she might have given him. "You are saving my mother's rose," he said from the gate, in the tone of a man arriving at a fact rather than a question. "I am saving a rose that happens to be your mother's," Cassia said, not looking up from the graft, "though I grant you the distinction is thinner than I would like it to be." She tied off the last binding and sat back on her heels, breath fogging in the cold. "It will take. I have grafted worse wood onto less hope than this." He watched her a long moment, the frost silvering the ivy behind her, and said, with the broken, self-interrupting honesty that had become, over 2 months, the only kind of speech he trusted himself to produce around her, "I have been trying to write to Lord Pemberton for 4 days. I keep starting the letter and finding that every honest sentence in it is about you, instead of his daughter, and I do not know how to write a refusal, that does not also announce the reason for it to the entire county? Then perhaps, Cassia said, you ought to stop writing the refusal, and write the reason instead, and let the county work out the rest for themselves. They generally do, faster than we credit them for. He did not answer that directly. He only stood a while longer at the gate of the garden he had not entered for 9 years, until a woman with mud on her hands had walked in and made it a garden again instead of a held breath, and something in his face, watching her tie off the last of the failing canes with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, arrived at a decision he did not yet say aloud, though it was, by that point, no longer really in doubt. Cassia's birthday fell 9 days later, on a bitter bright morning in the 2nd week of January, and it was on the strength of that date, and no other, that the Duke of Hallamare finally crossed the whole distance of his own 9 years of arithmetic in a single afternoon. He rode to the vicarage cottage, repaired now, its roof sound, its garden cleared, though Cassia did not yet know whose hand had ordered it done, where she had gone to visit her aunt for the week before her birthday, and he arrived with his hair not quite settled from the ride, and no clear plan beyond the plain fact that he could not, having tried for 4 days, construct a version of the coming week that did not have her in the centre of it. "I have a document," he said, standing in her aunt's small parlour with snow still on his boots, "which states that I will not marry a woman of 30. "I am aware of the document," Cassia said. "It is somewhat well known. You are 30. "I am aware of that also," she said, having been present at the event. "You will be 31, he said, in 9 days. I had noticed that as well, being, as previously stated, present for most of my own birthdays. He took a breath that did not entirely hold, and when he spoke again the sentences came apart in the middle, the way they always did with him, when the thing being said mattered too much to say smoothly. "I find I can wait 9 days. I did not think I could wait 9 years ago, when I wrote that clause, because waiting seemed a kind of cowardice dressed up as prudence, and I have been governing this house on that mistake ever since. But 9 days is not 9 years. 9 days I can manage, because you moved a goose's entire opinion of me in a single fountain, and because you found £11 in a ledger 4 accountants missed, and because you grafted new wood onto my mother's rose without asking whether I wanted it saved, which I did, though I had not said so to anyone, including myself. Because the garden is a garden again, instead of a room I could not walk past. Because I have not once, since October, needed Mrs. Pruitt's ledger to tell me what I was feeling, only what I looked like feeling it, which is a different thing entirely, and I would like the rest of my life to be the first kind." He stopped, visibly startled by the length of what had come out of him, and finished more simply, "I have already spoken to the vicar. I would like to marry you at first light 9 days from now, the precise hour you turn 31, so that my own standard may go on believing itself obeyed, and so that I need not spend one further day arguing with a rule I no longer wish to keep." Cassia looked at him for a moment with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to stay composed, and then the laugh came up out of her the way it always did, involuntary, whole, entirely unperformed, except that this time it did not stop after a moment. It went on, helpless and bright, for the better part of 8 full seconds, by her aunt's later insistent counting. And somewhere in the middle of it Gideon began laughing too, an unfamiliar, rusty, wonderful sound that his own household would not have recognised had they been present, 4 full seconds of it, matched almost exactly to the near smile the under-gardener had reported in November, except that this time Nobody needed a ledger to confirm it, because it did not stop being true the moment it was noticed. Yes, she said, when she could speak again. Obviously, yes. Though I would point out that marrying me the exact instant I turned 31, to satisfy a clause you yourself wrote and could simply strike out with a pen, is either the most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me, or the most thoroughly ridiculous, and I have decided I do not need to choose between the two. Both, he agreed. It has generally been both, with you, since the fountain. The wedding, 9 days later, was small, cold, and entirely without the drama that weddings in grander stories are permitted to indulge in. It took place at first light in the chapel at Hallowmere, the exact hour, by Whitlock's careful watch, at which Cassia Merrow's 31st year officially began, so that the Duke of Hallowmere might marry her having technically, by the letter of his own long-defunct standard, never once married a woman of 30 at all. Aunt Cordelia wept through the whole of it, and denied doing so immediately afterward, with a fierceness nobody bothered to argue with. Mrs. Pruitt closed her ledger for the last time that morning, the final entry reading simply resolved, and retired it to a drawer where, some years later, a granddaughter would find it and not entirely understand what it had been counting, though she would understand enough. Plato attended without an invitation, entering the chapel through a door left carelessly ajar, and settling himself in the front pew beside Cordelia with the proprietary air of a creature who considered the whole match his own achievement, which, given the fountain, was not entirely an unreasonable position to hold. He was removed twice, and returned twice, and on the second return the vicar simply continued the service around him, on the grounds that a goose determined to attend a wedding is a smaller obstacle than a duke determined to marry a woman his own document forbade, and the household had learned this past winter to save its objections for battles worth having. And the rose, Cassia said afterward, at the small breakfast that followed. To Gideon, quietly, comes with me into whatever we do with the garden. That is non-negotiable. I had assumed as much, he said. I have already told the head gardener the walled garden is to be reopened entirely, and that Seraphina's folly is to be propagated properly this time, in numbers, so that it need not depend on one stubborn plant surviving one hard frost ever again. 2 conditions in one sentence, Cassia said. You are learning. I have had an excellent teacher, he said, and a very poor goose. By June the walled garden at Hallowmere had bloomed in a way the oldest tenants on the estate could not remember it blooming even in the old Duchess's time. Seraphina's folly climbing the east wall in a mass of pale gold flowers that the head gardener, at Cassia's insistence, had finally succeeded in grafting onto rootstock hardy enough to spread it through half the county's finest gardens by the following spring. The nursery wing, sealed since Seraphina's death alongside the garden gate, had been aired and painted and stood ready, its purpose an open and comfortable secret nobody at Hallowmere felt any need to hurry. The stopped clock in the old Duchess's morning room had been wound again, and now kept time as faithfully as any other in the house, which Cordelia considered, privately, the single most significant restoration of the whole affair. Mrs. Pruitt reported, that same June, in conversation with a housekeeper from a neighbouring estate who had heard rumours and come to see for herself, that his Grace now smiled most mornings before he had so much as reached his coffee, and had been seen, on at least one occasion, laughing at something the goose had done, which the neighbouring housekeeper found difficult to credit until Whitlock, summoned to confirm it, performed a single, unmistakable, entirely voluntary blink of both eyelids at once, a gesture nobody at Hallowmere had ever witnessed from him before, and which the staff took, correctly, as the equivalent of a standing ovation. Aunt Cordelia lived another 11 years at Hallowmere, long enough to see two grandnieces walk the garden paths her own hands had once tended alongside Seraphina's, and told anyone who would listen that she had known the whole business would end well from the exact moment a woman had answered her interrogation honestly instead of well, which was, she maintained, the only answer that had ever mattered in that house or any other. Lord Pemberton's daughter Henrietta married, within the year, a baronet of her own, choosing who suited her considerably better than a duke twice her age ever could have. And nobody at Hallamere gave the matter another thought, which would have wounded Lord Pemberton a great deal had he ever learned of it, though he did not. Plato lived to a scandalous old age, ruled the reopened garden as though it had always been his to rule, and was, by unanimous household consent, never once forgiven for the glove, though he was, by the same consent, entirely and permanently beloved. The standard itself was found, some years later, tucked into the back of an estate ledger nobody had thought to clear out, its clauses faded, and its fourth clause circled twice in a hand that was unmistakably the Duke's own, with a single line added beneath it in ink considerably fresher than the rest. Amended, on excellent authority, to no age at all, only the right woman, whenever she arrives, however late the arithmetic says she is. There are rules that exist to keep a house safe, and rules that exist only to keep a heart from having to risk itself, and it takes a particular kind of courage to learn. 9 years too late by one's own reckoning, and exactly on time by every reckoning that matters, which kind of rule one has been keeping all along. Attention, it turns out, is the whole of the argument. Certainty was never the price of it. The garden bloomed that June the way it had bloomed before the house learned to hold its breath, and it went on blooming every June after, which was, in the end, the only ledger anyone at Hallamere still bothered to keep.